Just after dawn on October 7th, 2023, Palestinian fighters belonging to the group Hamas broke out of the besieged Gaza Strip. After blowing through Israel's high-tech fence, they attacked several of the surrounding military bases and overran them, before moving on to Israeli communities near the border. At least 1,300 Israelis were killed and dozens were captured and taken into Gaza to be used in a future prisoner swap. Many of the dead were deemed civilians under international law, and children were also among those killed. Many governments have rallied behind Israel, which has already bombarded Gaza with airstrikes, flattening neighborhoods and killing at least 1,900 Palestinians at the time of this recording. Israel has also cut off water, electricity, fuel, and food to the people there and declared a total siege. So why did Hamas attack Israel? A lot of the condemnation of the Hamas attack has called it unprovoked, but is that accurate? Now, the purpose here isn't to condone or justify it. It's to understand why it happened, because if we don't, then it's more likely that we'll see this happening over and over again. While things may have been calm and normal for Israelis until then, for Palestinians, daily life was intolerable pain. In fact, for 16 years, Gaza has been under an Israeli siege so severe that it's often called the world's largest open-air prison. The Secretary General of the United Nations has described Gaza as hell on earth. And way back in 2012, the UN warned that if Israel's policies in Gaza didn't change, this tiny strip of land that's one of the most densely populated places on earth would become unfit for human living by 2020. It's now 2023. And in fact, analysts who had been paying attention were trying to sound the alarm, that things were getting worse, that the status quo was getting more and more untenable, that an explosion was inevitable. The siege began when Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, a year after winning the Palestinian Authority elections. You see, Hamas was founded in Gaza in the late 1980s, 20 years into Israel's occupation of the territory. The group has a military wing, but it's also a political party. Its stated goal is to liberate all of Palestine and the return of Palestinian refugees exiled during Israel's founding in 1948. And it has always said that the only way to achieve that goal is to fight. For the 2.3 million Palestinians who live in Gaza, the 16-year siege means that Israel controls basically everything about their lives, and it has created a humanitarian catastrophe for them. The economy is devastated because Israel limits Gaza's trade with the outside world, leaving most of the population unemployed. The health sector has also been in crisis, with medicines frequently running out and patients denied Israeli permits to leave for life-saving healthcare. And electricity only lasts a few hours a day because Israel limits the amount of fuel let into Gaza. At one point, official documents showed that Israel calculated the number of calories allowed into Gaza, just enough to keep people from starving. Nearly half of Gaza's population is under 18. That means most of the people living there have never been able to leave Gaza. They've never stepped foot in Jerusalem or met a fellow Palestinian from the occupied West Bank. And they've survived several major attacks, leaving them with unimaginable trauma. Tens of thousands of homes and buildings were targeted and destroyed by Israel during these assaults, which left thousands of Palestinians dead. For example, in the summer of 2014 alone, at least 2,100 Palestinians, including at least 500 children, were killed by Israeli bombardment. In that conflict, 72 Israelis were killed, 66 of them soldiers. Despite some international criticism, Israel has never faced serious calls to end its siege on Gaza. In 2018, tens of thousands of Gazans tried to break the siege by marching non-violently onto the boundary fence with Israel every Friday for almost 2 years. They were met with gunfire. For weeks, Israeli soldiers shot at those attempting to get close, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries, including medics and journalists. Even before Hamas took control of Gaza, Israel had subjected the territory to a closure since the 1990s. This meant that Palestinians could rarely enter or exit Gaza unless they had a rare Israeli permit. This policy is part of a larger Israeli military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank that's now lasted more than half a century. Multiple human rights groups around the world have found that Israel actually runs a system of apartheid with separate laws for Israelis and Palestinians. Ultimately, this means that Israel is a state that, based on ethnicity, denies citizenship and rights to the millions of people over which it rules, i.e., the Palestinians. Under international law, Israel's occupation, which is now in its 56th year, is illegal, and apartheid is a crime against humanity. Meanwhile, the occupied West Bank is ruled by Hamas's political rival, the Palestinian Authority, which rejects confrontation with Israel, hoping to end the occupation through US-led peace talks. But since those peace talks began 30 years ago, Israel has only expanded its illegal settlements on Palestinian land, and the occupation has become more entrenched. Time and time again, Palestinians have seen that negotiations, peaceful marches, and other non-violent means of protests have not gotten them any closer to achieving freedom and rights. In the meantime, the overall situation for Palestinians living under Israel's occupation has steadily gotten worse. The current Netanyahu government, the most right-wing and anti-Arab in Israel's history, includes leaders who have openly called for the renewed ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and the destruction of entire Palestinian towns. In 2023 alone, they've incited several attacks on Palestinian villages in the West Bank, attacks that even Israeli observers referred to as pogroms, referring to the anti-Semitic rampages suffered by Jews in Eastern Europe. Armed Israeli settlers smashed homes, burned cars, and set fire to fields. When Palestinians tried to defend their property, Israeli forces shot at them, both with live fire and rubber-coated bullets, as well as tear gas. Israeli politicians and settlers have also repeatedly entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, where Israeli forces have attacked Palestinian worshippers. By the way, they've been open about their attempts to destroy the mosque and build a new Jewish temple atop it. And the number of Palestinians killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers in the West Bank hit a 20-year high in 2023. The scale of the Hamas attack was unprecedented in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While dis and misinformation has spread widely in the aftermath about precisely what happened, there's no doubt that Israeli civilians were targeted. It's important to remember that Israel has one of the best equipped militaries in the world and the backing of many Western governments. That's why it's always been able to inflict far more death on Palestinians than vice versa. This has been the case ever since the state was founded in 1948, when it used that force to expel most Palestinians from their homes in what became Israel. In fact, around 2/3 of people who live in Gaza are refugees or their descendants. Many of them come from towns and villages just across the boundary fence. Some of those villages, now with Hebrew names and Israeli residents, were among the areas where Hamas fighters entered and attacked. Back in Gaza, things look apocalyptic. Israel's defense minister has ordered fuel, electricity, and even water to be cut off, saying his government is dealing with, quote, human beasts. The only power plant in Gaza has officially run out of fuel, leaving 2.3 million people with no electricity and in the dark. With fighter jets, artillery, and warships under his command, it's expected that the already massive Palestinian death toll is only going to climb. Also, keep in mind that Gaza is under a blockade, which means when the bombs drop, Palestinians are trapped there with nowhere to flee and no bomb shelters to go to. Israel had previously launched large-scale wars against Hamas in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021 with the stated goal of stopping Hamas. But while these wars inflicted catastrophic damage on Gaza's civilian population and infrastructure, they clearly did not stop Hamas. A military solution has not worked. Israeli journalist Gideon Levy just wrote in Haaretz, Israel can't imprison 2 million Gazans without paying a cruel price. And Levy is onto something. What's missing in all of this context is the root cause of it all, a deeply violent apartheid system and an occupation that robs Palestinians of their land, freedom, and right to self-determination. Meanwhile, the world does little to push Israel to end this system, and instead, often provides it with the aid and cover to maintain it instead. To find out how Israel subjugates Palestinians under its apartheid system and more on how Israel came to be, watch these explainers from AJ Plus next.